ideals are not enough to secure peace and freedom. Only military superiority and the will to use it, only that will do.
Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1998 receiving the Ronald Reagan Freedom Award. Mrs. Thatcher stressed the importance of balancing noble ideals with military supremacy to secure freedom in our world. And Margaret Thatcher is widely regarded as one of the greatest world leaders in modern history, helping to bring about a successful end to the Cold War. But in a new book, one author explores how Mrs. Thatcher tried to incorporate her father's Protestant teachings to reinvigorate Great Britain with spiritual values. Let's welcome in that aforementioned author, Eliza Filby. Eliza's new book is titled God and Mrs. Thatcher, The Battle for Britain's Soul. And Eliza joins us tonight from Boston. It's good to have you on this side of the Atlantic, Eliza, and as we look at our British cousins, and specifically Mrs. Thatcher, we take note of the fact that her father was a pastor, and she wanted to incorporate some of his teachings into her leadership. Why was that so important to her personally and politically?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Margaret Thatcher grew up in a very strict Methodist household. Her father, as you quite rightly mentioned, was a lay preacher. And as a child, she used to attend chapel, not once, twice, but 3 times on the Sabbath. She had a very strict Methodist father who used to stand in the pews stand in the pulpit, rather, of that chapel in Finken Street Methodist Church in Lincolnshire, where she grew up. And he would hammer home sermons on individual liberty, moral worth, thrift, you know, all of these kind of core values that for her, listening as a child, they were core to her fundamental beliefs. And as she went into politics, she translated what was a religious message about the individual and freedom and free will into a political message about individualism, free will and liberty. And so therefore what my book explores is really, having looked at her father's sermons, that the origins of Thatcherism was not monetarism, really, wasn't economics, but was religion, and more specifically, the religious teachings of her lay preacher father.
And so from those Methodist roots, if you will, and her father's sermons as a lay Methodist minister, when she became prime minister and started this reinvigoration, started what became known as Thatcherism, if I understand correctly, you characterize what she did as a failed crusade. How did it fail, and why?
Well, in many ways, Margaret Thatcher came into Downing Street with a very sort of short and solid determination to reinvigorate not only the economic sort of climate of the country, but the moral climate of the country. Now, she was not like a sort of moral conservative like you get in the US. She was very actually liberal when it came to issues of sexual morality. She saw her moral crusade as one of reinstilling values, individual values, core Christian values that she had learnt as a child, and that in her view had gone into and fallen into disarray within Britain by the 1970s. And when I talk of those values, I mean a sort of individual responsibility, devotion to thrift, the idea that you save before you spend, the notion of the responsibility that comes with wealth. You know, she very much looked to the parable of the Good Samaritan in justifying her idea that, you know, the Good Samaritan could only have helped because he had money, and she believed that in taxing people less and giving more of their own money to keep for themselves, they would therefore turn themselves into good Samaritans, give to charity, support philanthropic projects. But actually, Margaret Thatcher's government, her time in power, did not give rise to a more Christian society. Actually, Britain became a much more secular, diverse, multicultural society. She did not give rise to a country devoted to thrift, but actually consumption and debt.
And in retrospect, why was that? For example, liberal immigration policy, so many people coming from the Middle East. About 30 seconds, Eliza.
Well, not really immigration. It's just that when you unleash the force of the free market, but do not put any constraints, whether they be individual, Christian, or state regulatory, you unleash, a kind of chaos that is out of control. You know, in good times, debt is seen as freedom and opportunity. In bad times, at time of bust, it's seen as a form of oppression. And I think one of the interesting things about Margaret Thatcher was one of her greatest regrets, as she said, I thought I would create a giving society, however, I did not. And it's the idea that actually Mrs. Thatcher came into Downing Street pledging to recreate a Christian nation, but actually giving rise to one that was a devouts of the free market rather than devouts of Christ.
Fair enough. We thank you very much for your time. The name of the book again, God and Mrs. Thatcher, The Battle for Britain's Soul. Our thanks to author Eliza Filby, and we'll be right back.